even though this isn't terribly crucial. All right. Oh, and then the one that a lot of people are going to have to think about a little bit. Explain the purpose of this sort of analysis. You know, in other words, why do we analyze empire and colonialism and all this? And explain it in the context of the historical development of both the colonizer or the empire or whatever you want to call it and the colonized. Okay. In other words, I want to give you an opportunity to extrapolate from what we've read and do a little bit of thinking on the page and thinking, oh, I can see why this would be useful because, okay. And it also gives me a chance to hear your own thinking in addition to your ability to just regurgitate things you've read, okay? It's the due date I've posted is Sunday the 18th, which is, you know, this coming Sunday at 11 p.m. I think that gives you more than enough time, particularly is if some of you, but not all of you, if you have been keeping notes as we've gone along, you'll be able to go in there and you'll have a nice little gold mine of things from which to do your shopping and satisfy your you know, commercial ends. But some of you, particularly on the second group of readings, in fact, I would say most of you have done little or nothing in terms of keeping notes. That's on you. I mean, you do whatever. It's going to influence the way I evaluate your work, because if I see kind of a half-baked essay and I look and see, yeah, and you didn't do much in terms of taking notes, that tells me, nope, you didn't do that well because you didn't care that much. If you're sitting there and you're thinking, yeah, Bill, I really don't, all right? I have to take this class because fill in the blank. Okay, I'm just saying, don't be surprised with the magical C+ that you get, you know? Try not to let it ruin your day. Because I would say that's only slightly above average, which is a C+, okay? Some of you obviously have really thrown yourselves into this. You're really trying. I can tell by the way you're keeping notes. You're trying to build a model in your head, which is the one thing many of you have had classes with me before. It's the one thing I'm always trying to emphasize. You know, make a model in your head so you can change angles and look at this thing, because you think at least that you understand the way the important moving parts fit together, okay? All right, so are there any questions on the midterm? Okay. One of the things that some of you have met with me, a few of you have met with me independently to discuss your case study of, you know, decolonization. Most of you haven't. It isn't required. But I want to make sure that at this point, you probably should have selected or be in the process of selecting your case. All right, I'm going to look at, you know, I'm going to look at Kenya, and it interests me because, you know, you have a white settler colony. That's one of the types of colony that we've discussed, you know, and then you have the impact of the Second World War. You have the mobilization of the askari, some of whom came out of Kenya to actually, you know, be support or combat troops for the empire. As a consequence of that, you've got a growing sense of, among some Kenyans, that enough is enough, and, you know, the colony should end. They want control of those, what are called the White Highlands. And then, of course, you have the radicalization of Mau Mau and all that kind of stuff. So I kind of have a case, and I kind of know why, all right? That's where I would like you to be, I would say no later than the end of the week. If you're having trouble doing that, okay, you can either say you've got a couple of things you're thinking about. Send me an email. Tell me which cases, and then tell me, if you can, why you think those cases might be interesting. Because what I can do is I can give you an indication of, well, there's less scholarship on that one than there is on that one. On the other hand, because of that, you might find it more interesting. It really is going to depend on what you're interested in. I think the key to people succeeding with this assignment will be to select a case that you're interested in already. That somehow there's something about that, especially given the last couple of weeks of reading and discussion. Now you look at that and you look at it with fresh eyes and think, you know what, I want to figure out how that worked. Okay. There isn't any case you're going to choose that's going to be particularly difficult. There's been a great deal written about all of them. It's not about how difficult they are. It's about what you can learn from analyzing them. That's more important to me. So don't worry about trying to pick a difficult or problematic case, right? If you want to pick a well-trodden, you know, well-examined case, and look at that, that's okay. That's, you know, it's like, well, hey guys, so you got training wheels on the bike, you know, you're like 4, you got to learn how to ride. Falling down's a drag. I get that. So, you know, do something you're comfortable with. As long as you're learning, I don't really care. Okay. Now, does anybody have any questions about that? You know what I'm talking about, right? This is your culminating assignment. Okay. We have talked about this.
Yeah. Oh, I was going to email you actually this evening. I'm thinking about doing Panama. Does that seem like a good case study for you?
Ooh, well, you would pick one that was kind of a border case. You know, it's like, well, Panama. First of all, Panama arguably can be looked at as an imperial creation. Okay, it's not merely a colony. It's a kind of geopolitical fiction in some ways. But I would say
that's why I
no.
like
You know what? I like the thinking though. I mean, Paul, if you feel like you can take it on, and you begin to have a picture in your head, because remember what you might come up with, not just Paul, but anybody who's interested. If you come up with something and say, okay, this may not fit the mold of what we've been talking about, but I'm going to use the concepts and the literature we've been using here along with other scholarship to make the case that even though this doesn't fit elegantly into the model we've got of what's a colonial possession or what colonialism is, I'm going to argue for why it is colonialism, because it's got this, this, and this. Paul, if you're down to do that, then I would say, yeah. I wouldn't have chosen it, but that doesn't mean anything. Part of it, it's not a part of, I'm not as interested in Central America as I am in other parts of the world. That's probably the main reason.
I was thinking either that or Belgian Congo, and I'm sure Belgian Congo has been gone over hundreds of times.
Which would then be essentially right now largely would be the DRC. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, then you have the whole Heart of Darkness, Joseph Conrad.
I know
you know what? It's great. You know why? Because one of the things I was going to point out that you would then want to maybe look at this book right here, Edward Said. Let me see if I can center this. Culture and Imperialism. Okay. What I'm going to talk about just a little bit today. And what he uses Joseph Conrad a lot. Another thing to think about, you may not necessarily be coming to this as an orthodox political scientist. Maybe what you're really interested in is what Said was writing about with culture and imperialism. To what degree is the colonial, anti-colonial, and post-colonial experience articulated through theater or literature or something like that? You still have to deal with the elements of colonialism, okay? But your vantage point is slightly different, okay? Or maybe your interest is more purely economic. Well, then go with what you know. Play to your strength on this, okay? I don't want everyone to think, well, there's only one way to do this assignment. It kind of defeats the whole purpose of this course, which is start with you where you are in terms of your interests and your intellectual strengths, and then use those things you have, refined by our discussions in literature, to take on this challenge of a case of, decolonization. Paul's example is a perfect illustration of that. Yeah, it doesn't easily fit the orthodox models. So what? By the way, you may ultimately find, you know what, it really doesn't fit. Guess what? That's not bad research. You still made an important contribution by saying, you know what, those things we were talking about modeling colonialism, actually what my case shows is why we need to do that. You know what I'm saying, Paul? I'm not trying to discourage you. I'm saying there's nothing wrong with that at all.
Yeah, that's kind of why I have, Congo as a backup idea. I'm going to do some digging into Panama. I've studied it pretty thoroughly in other classes, but I figure I'll have a solid decision on what I'm doing by the end of the week.
I think that's fine, and I like the fact that you've got another one in your back pocket that is it's rich and it's fascinating, but it's accessible by comparison with Panama, I would suggest. But so that's one of the things I want you to think about. Is some of you I know for sure are much more interested in the political economy of all this. You're much more interested in maybe the private commercial sector driving empire and things like that. Others of you were thinking, no, what I'm really looking at is I'm interested in radicalization, mobilization, and insurgency in anti-colonial struggles. Okay, then there obviously is a different set of cases that might work better for you. So let's see, who's the author of the Culture and Imperialism? Edward Said, S-A-I-D, Edward Said. And he's written a great deal of, Cole, I'm sorry, Cole, did you have your hand up with your muted microphone?
So I thought that this was kind of an interesting discussion, and as a political science and international studies student, I've been taking great interest in this, and I was curious about your opinions. There's a lot of talks on the similarity connecting colonialism to the situation in Belarus, right now with its independence from Russia.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, like how close do you think those parallels actually connect, and do you think that that's like an accurate like description / like parallel?
I think not for exactly the same reasons, but I think that analytically and empirically is something more like the Panama case, where you have it isn't really though, but I think if you look at Kennedy's book and you look at the Reinhardt book, it's pretty clear that a lot of these colonial historians would consider the creation of the Soviet Union to be the expansion of a colonial empire. Okay, that would certainly include Belarus. It would include Ukraine, but more importantly, it would include, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, all the so-called stans and things like that. Those places clearly were colonized. Okay, and so I think, just as I'm analytically ambivalent with respect to Panama, so too with Belarus, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. That's not a reason not to do it. Again, you have the advantage there, Cole, in that it's timely and a great deal is being written about it right now and discussed about it right now. But there's a rich history of the creation of that territory as a kind of nominal nation state, and then its kind of absorption into the Soviet sphere. But it's not like it's Bulgaria, which arguably was a colony of the Soviet Union. When you think of what's called sometimes the Eastern Bloc during the Cold War, another way to think about that is, when we met, when the Allies met with Stalin, Yalta and Potsdam, one of the settlements was, okay, in a sense, how are we going to divide up the world now? It was kind of like a scramble for Africa kind of thing. And it's clear that there was this concession to the Soviet Union. You know what? You can have those, what we call buffer states that became the Eastern Bloc or the Iron Curtain or whatever. Cole, if you look at that as colonialism and you look at what we've discussed in terms of empire and colonialism, and you can make the case that fits, that satisfies you intellectually, right? Then I would say absolutely do. Remember, there's no failure in this assignment. If at the end of doing your research, you realize it doesn't quite fit, you've still learned a lot. The only charge upon you then is to explain to me what you've learned. Okay? So I would say go big. That's like you're swinging for the fences on that one. But why would I not want you to do that? Yeah, I think that's a great idea. It's a measure, Cole, really of how confident you feel about it. Yeah, but I would say absolutely full speed ahead. If you think the literature's there, if you've done a little preliminary reading, for example, and you find, oh God, there's some really great stuff that was written in this period of time. It was sort of a scholarly thing to do for a while on Belarus and the whole history of that and everything else. You might even do what I did as an undergraduate, right? And I generated some laughter, but the professor had to admit, that is kind of clever. I kind of came up with a new model of something that was like a neo version of the model that the historian was talking about. What I wanted to take that in and work on it as a PhD thing, not come to think of it, yeah, I probably would have and probably should have. I'd have been a happier boy. But there are a lot of reasons to swing for the fences. If you're confident that either you can hit it out of the park because you're right, or you can make enough contact that you can say, oh, I see why, now I know better why this wouldn't fit. Either one of those is valuable research. Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Then again, I would be absolutely encouraging you to do that. Okay. But I would say that in terms of, I want to make sure everyone has sufficient time to do this, because you're only going to get busier as the year goes on. We're going to lose a week on Thanksgiving, that is a week you can work, but I can't hold classes. I'm not allowed to work during that week. That's part of our pay cut. Okay. That's what furlough days are. So, technically I can't help you during that week. And you know how important I think that is. But I would say that probably by the end of this week, you should have a pretty good idea, at least, okay, I know what my case is. I better start doing some preliminary reading, right? And so anything else on the assignment at this point? I just want to make sure that you're not forgetting about it and that you're beginning to do at least some preliminary stage thinking about how to do it. Okay, now when you say French conquest of Algeria, then what you're looking at is Algeria as a colony. Okay, it's not just the French conquest. Okay, remember what this class is emphasizing is decolonization. Algeria obviously is a great example. You know, I can refer you to Frantz Fanon for the psychological perspective on that. There's been a tremendous amount. You're going to have to watch, you know, Battle of Algiers, the film, and all kinds of things. There's a lot that's been done on Algeria. It's a textbook case of violent anti-colonialism, okay, with a settler colony and, you know, an attempt at least to sort of infuse that into a greater France and this kind of stuff. So obviously Algeria would be a fascinating case. Even I don't care if it's been done, you will learn by doing it. Okay, it's especially valuable, by the way, if you speak French and can find primary sources in French. You know, then you can make it even richer. But do I expect that? No, I don't. You know, that's okay, but it's a bonus. Okay, anything else in terms of that particular assignment? Is everyone kind of more or less understanding what I'm asking you to do, though? And there are guidelines on the syllabus and things like that. I'm trying not to be too rigid with the guidelines because I really want you to feel like you've got whatever latitude you feel you need to approach this assignment in a way that is interesting to you, rather than just say everyone has to do it the same way. I don't like to impose that. By way of illustrating that, I don't think any of you were in my classes yesterday, but my oldest boy just turned, my God, he just turned 27. So anyway, I was on the Skyping with him, you know, the little whippersnapper, who's much taller than I am, thank God. Actually, no, thank DNA, thank Darwin. But anyway, he had this link. You've all done these things. It's one of those ideological quizzes, like where do you fit ideologically, and all that. And not surprisingly, came out sort of economically, probably somewhat left of center, but in terms of the authoritarian to libertarian scale, extremely libertarian. And I think that sort of shows up in the way that I try to teach classes. I hate telling people what to do. I like encouraging people to discover things that give them some benefit, as opposed to just telling you what to do. So it's not that I'm trying to be cagey. I'm actually telling you, I trust you as individual scholars, but I'm here to help you if you need it. You feel like you're hitting a wall. Other than that, I just don't want to be dictatorial about this assignment, because clearly, you know, the online quizzes say that I don't do that. So now I can't do that. All right. So that's what that's about. All right. Again, feel free to email me if you need it. If you feel like you'd be reassured by a brief, you know, Zoom individual office meeting or something like that, we can do that as well. I'll leave it up to you, but I'm going to trust you on this to stay focused and get a case that you're satisfied with. All right. In terms of kind of following up from where we left off with our last class, I asked you to, oh, that's nice. Looks like somebody got a link for that, Culture and Imperialism. I was going to assign that book, but I couldn't. I'm really reluctant to copy extensive amounts of a book, and some of them don't have really elegant chapters. I'll give you an example of that later on. But I think it's worth reading if you are interested in that. If you're not interested in literature and the fine arts and stuff like that, that book by Said will bore you. But if you are, it's a very interesting, it's somewhat dated by now, given that it was written in the 90s. It's an interesting approach that wasn't common at the time it was written. But I asked you, in terms of follow-up, to look up some information on the 1884-85 Berlin Conference, leading to or part of what led to the Scramble for Africa, sort of a way to manage it, ground rules for it. This sociological concept of opportunity structures. And then a little bit about two authors whose work could be useful to you, but that I didn't require, in part because, and I'll give you an example of that. Albert Memmi's book, right? The thing about this is there are chapter breaks, but the chapters are long. And I just felt like I'm trying not to saturate you with dictated reading. Here, everyone has to read this. But Memmi's book is worthwhile to read, this book, The Colonizer and the Colonized, because what he does is he tries to give you an insight, and I think does an interesting job. He does what he calls these portraits. And the first portrait is the portrait of the colonizer. And he talks about two kinds of colonizer. He calls them the colonizer who refuses and the colonizer who accepts. Okay. So if, you know, what he says is that there's a cohort of people who go to the colony, either in the private sector or as part of the administration, who are appalled by the conditions they see there and the inequality and the really abhorrent treatment of whoever the indigents are. And they say, oh my God, this is terrible, you know, and they're resisting colonialism or some of it, so that they're colonizers in the sense that they're part of the colonial mission. They're not what he refers to as colonialists in the sense that they don't ideologically favor that or justify it as easily as would be the portrait of the person who accepts colonialism, who becomes the more enthusiastic colonizer. So what I'm saying is that Memmi's book is valuable in part because it's at least partially non-Western. You know, he was born in Tunis and grew up as a Tunisian. He was imprisoned during the Second World War. So he's got this really fascinating personal struggle that informs his work, okay? But you don't have to read it. What I'm doing is suggesting other people to look at. The other one, obviously, and he wrote a couple books that are pertinent here. You've all heard of Frantz Fanon. This is Wretched of the Earth. He was trained as a psychiatrist. He's from Martinique, but his most significant political experience is actually in Algeria. Okay. Then he wrote one called Dying Colonialism, another good book. And again, you know, I would have, if I'd been at Harvard or something where you all had lots of mommy and daddy's money, I would have assigned all these books and expected you to read all of them within a week. Okay, but we don't do that here because, you know, we just don't play that. The advantage of Fanon is, again, although trained under colonialism, having the worldview of the colonized, and then taking that out of his home, Martinique, going to Algeria and becoming a very visible, dynamic part of that Algerian resistance and anti-colonialism, and absolutely coming down on the side of violence, okay? It's seldom that you see someone writing as a scholar who has that point of view. He's like Che Guevara with chops, you know? There's nothing really very fraudulent about him. And so those are really interesting, but that's why I mentioned Memmi and Fanon. I also have a bad habit of for some reason, leaving out the T in Frantz Fanon's name. So if you see it written as F-R-A-N-Z, I've actually seen publications where his first name has been spelled F-R-A-N-Z, so I don't feel too bad. But Frantz Fanon, Albert Memmi, there are others as well we could look at. The novelist Chinua Achebe has written some interesting essays from both the Igbo and the more broadly Nigerian point of view on colonialism and decolonization. Ngugi wa Thiong'o, also Kenyan, has a very interesting orientation to writing both as the colonized and the post-colonial, when he chose no longer to write in English. There are a lot of ways that you can look at this. And this gets into that Edward Said area where, gee, let's hear from the artists and the authors and, you know, the creative intellectuals. Okay. So that's what's going on there. That's why I had you look at those. Now, having done that, and of course you all did that and took copious notes on all of those things, are there any questions on any of those four things? Because every one of them is valuable going forward.
I do have some thoughts. I'm not sure if they're like questions, but
Well, that's all right. No, or just responses, comments.
Yeah.
Sure, that's fine. Go ahead.
So I tried looking into everything you asked us to look into, and what jumped out to me was Frantz Fanon's psychological work. because he wrote about how in the time he lived in, although I don't think that has what he says is less true now, is that as a black person, he always had to, he and every black person who lived in predominantly white controlled societies,
Yeah.
they were psychologically always aware of the fact they were black. And that actually reminded me of W.E.B. Du Bois' Ryan Souls of Black Folk, which
Right.
I actually read that in an existentialism class, if you believe it.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And it's hard to put this in like 100 words, but
Then put it in
No.
120.
but
We got nothing but time, man.
Fanon and Du Bois' writings about what it is like to be black men living in a world where they can't ignore the veil that separates them from the color of their skin between white and black.
Right.
And Fanon himself talking about like psychologically about he dissed Sigmund Freud, which I think that's part of the reason you like him.
No, actually not. You must know. I think that most of what Freud did was garbage.
Yeah, I know that. But like what he criticized about Sigmund Freud and a lot of contemporary psychologists is that none of these psychologists took into account a person's race and how this living as a differential other for their entire lives could have psychological effects on them.
Yeah, well, that's been a relatively recent breakthrough, and oddly enough, within the discipline of psychology, we can argue that Fanon was one of the people responsible for that breakthrough, although it came well after he had died. That's a great point. That, and it's Fanon also deals with that in his book Black Skin, White Masks. And that's another sort of anti-colonial book where what he does is he's trying to say that to the extent that race became a question of power, that it became politicized as part of the dispensation of power, and that's always the case with what we've already talked about, that alterity of colonialism, right? As a consequence of that, yeah, you never escape the fact, not merely that you are black, but that your blackness is a liability initially. You're taught that your blackness, your brownness, your otherness it exists, it makes you different, and it makes you less, and it's very hard to overcome that. And it's why, Fanon talks about, perhaps exaggerating a little bit and maybe over personalizing, as many psychologists are wont to do, but he talks about how the dream of the black colonized, particularly the black colonized man, is that the black colonized man dreams of having your power and your status and your property and your wife and all of you, right? But knows waking up he will never have that. What Fanon is arguing is that the only way to get that is to shatter that relationship of oppression, of psychological oppression that Graham's talking about. And that's a really good insight, because Fanon really struggles with that, right? And so what he's saying is he's drawn, he believes, to the inevitable conclusion that you have to destroy it, and that means by violence. You just kill it with fire, and that's why a lot of his work became so galvanic for kind of Black nationalist movements in the United States and things like that. Memmi, for example, when Memmi writes his book on the colonizer and the colonized, and you look at the dedication. Now, keep in mind that the first draft of Memmi's book was written, I think it's in 1959. I would have to look. I can't find it. I know the translation I have, 57. So this book is as old as me, okay? When he dedicates it in 1957, right? He dedicated this American edition, right? The American edition, 1965, is dedicated to the American Negro, also colonized. Okay, so that's a lot of what America's dealing with right now, and what you're finding in a lot of young scholarship, and a lot of your younger professors are bringing this out of graduate school, this idea of understanding race as internal colonization. If you take a class with Brooke Colley, for example, in Native American Studies, you're going to get that perspective, that she's going to tell you why she would analyze those as exercises in empire and colonial domination, for some of the same reasons that Graham was talking about, that Fanon writes about, because you otherize someone, and then you impose power relations on the basis of that othering, and then you reinforce it at the barrel of a gun. And so the idea is the only way to resist that is violence. Now, I'm not saying that's what Brooke Colley would say, but certainly that's what Fanon would say. Okay.
Is there?
Sorry, who did I say?
I have a
Oh,
question
go
about
ahead, Graham.
psychology, actually.
Yeah.
Would there happen to be a since I never took a psychology class here in SOU, do you know that would there happen to be a class at SOU that has a body of study similar to this, that dives into race and otherness?
Not that I know
and,
of.
yeah, that's the sort of thing.
I would say to take a look at the catalog. I didn't mean to cut you off, Graham, but I would say take a look at the catalog, but I'm not aware of anything like that on campus.
Well, it's like the critical race theory that right-wingers talk about, and if we put a class like that on a catalog, most men over in their 50s in like Metford would probably just roll their eyes at it.
Well, there are plenty of people who would roll their eyes at it, but that doesn't invalidate it. I mean, I roll my eyes at it all the time, but that doesn't invalidate it. I mean, Brooke teaches a class, or either Brooke does or Chance White Eyes does, teaches a class in, I think it's tribal and critical race theory. Okay, that is a school of thought that first developed as part of critical theory, I would argue, in the 1990s, right? So it's, by scholarly standards, it's relatively new. What I'm trying to suggest, and what I think you're sniffing out, is that, yeah, a lot of this stuff goes back to Fanon. All right, what I studied with Fanon, they're studying now with a lot of the critical theory people. My eye rolling comes in only when it ceases to function as authentic theory, which is compelled to be tested, which is compelled to validate its assumptions on the basis of available data of either qualitative or quantitative kind, right? And again, part of the rejection implicit in critical theory is an over-reliance on Western scientific method. So they got you coming and going, right? But I think that kind of intellectual struggle, if it's fully engaged, as I wish it was, if we were a real university, it would be publicly engaged. We'd be able to debate that without cutting each other's throats, or just crying and trying to grieve each other out of our careers, which we probably would do, given what scholars do. I think it's valuable. If it's shaking people up, it has a certain utility to it. And it's not like it's Nazism, you know, but it has an absolutism to it that makes some people uncomfortable. In other words, you know, there's a complaint among many. For example, I can't speak to conservative politicians because I think they have no beliefs, but I would say in terms of conservative intellectuals, conservative scholars, it's hard for them to wrap their brains around any fundamental view of the world other than the one they've had for the last 50 years, you know, and I get that. Simply not understanding something, as many older scholars want to do, is not the same thing as invalidating it. Simply because you don't understand, not you, but an older scholar in particular doesn't understand it, doesn't invalidate it. One of the reasons I'm teaching this class, okay, is because I'm trying to establish an environment within which real theory is operational, not my theory, but any theory that's functional. The critique of critical theory is, what is it beyond a descriptor, a claimant for redress of grievance? And this is why, you know, one of the reactions to this is people call it grievance studies. that what this is really is a focus on the grievances of peoples. Well, there's value in that, but is it pedagogically robust enough to carry people through a university? Because I don't want to, my concern is, I don't want you to think like me. I just want you to think, okay? I think one of the concerns about the less ethical critical theorists, for example, I don't think any of whom inhabit SOU, as far as I know, is they want you to think like them. And they want you to feel like if you're wrong, it's because you don't think like them. And if you don't think like them, you're wrong. In other words, it's the same thing that they are attacking, that they, in terms of the intellectual colonization, as they would call it, of the old Western Orthodox university tradition, you know. So it's sort of like, I better not do that because I'm going to be misunderstood. It would be like if a people who had been terrorized and oppressed finally got their independence, only to turn around and terrorize and oppress other people. It's like, what are you telling me? You know, what have we won? What have we learned here? And my concern is not very much, except that people are assholes in social science terms. Okay. But Graham, I like the thinking. I do. You know, when you're not being facetious and you actually apply yourself, you come up with these really cool insights that are really helpful. I want you to feel free to do that more frequently because you have a lot to say. All right. So, anything else just with respect to those particular things? The Berlin Conference is pretty easy to understand. I would say the only thing I would caution you on, sort of intellectually, is don't overvalue the Berlin Conference. It isn't deterministic. The whole world did not change after the Berlin Conference. It's important, but I've had to learn since I was an undergraduate and first learned about the Berlin Conference that it wasn't nearly as decisive or determinate as I was led at the time to believe it was by my instructors at the time. They weren't lying to me. That was the accepted scholarship. We've come to learn a lot more. And but I think it's important to keep that in mind. I would say particularly if you're interested in sub-Saharan Africa, but even more broadly, if you want to understand the dynamics of countervailing and competing empires and how they're all trying to carve out their sphere of influence in the world. Things like the Berlin Conference were an attempt to manage that by conceding, you know what, nobody but us has a right to claim territory. Nobody on the planet but the people sitting around this table. That's essentially what it was, to oversimplify. All right. Other than that, I mean, that was sort of my agenda for the day. I wanted to make sure that we were kind of caught up with all that. Now, we can do a couple of things, and I want to hear from you on this. We can either on Thursday, we can sort of break the label on the third module and begin to move ahead, or we can use Thursday, for those of you who want to show up and feel you need to, for some review before you do your midterm, or for discussions of your case studies and things like that. That is, we can use Thursday exclusively for review, or, you know, you can figure, no, let's move on, you know, and I want to know as a cohort, which do you think is more valuable right now for the class that we, you know, and again, if you don't feel you need a review, but 14 people in class feel they do, you don't have to show up. I won't take roll on Thursday if we use it as a review. I'll assume that if you're not there, it's because you're comfortable with where you are and you don't need, you've probably already begun your drafting out your midterm. Okay, so Jennifer says review before midterm. Anybody else? Any other thoughts? Review before midterm? Okay, and by the way, that would include what was just mentioned, case studies as well. If you want to take a few minutes, we could, in fact, we could review first, and then maybe 4 or 5 of you want to stick around and talk about your case studies. Okay, I just want to make sure that you have time to do that when I'm kind of at least virtually sitting in the room with you. I don't want you to feel like you're, you know, you're on your own and like I'm going to, you know, throw you into the deep end and then watch as you bubble away, which, by the way, was how I learned to swim. Come to think of it. Fortunately for a little guy, I was buoyant. I think it's my overlarge head. But anyway, let's see, need to work more on the case study. Okay, so it sounds like it's a combination of wanting to review and then maybe having the opportunity to work on case studies. Is that right? Does that sound about right? Now, again, if you don't need that, then consider it a day off. And, you can catch up with your other classes. You can use that time to maybe finish up any of the reading you haven't already done before your midterm, whatever you want to do. Because remember, one of the things I told you is, despite the fact that this is a fairly large class, as much as possible, I really would rather try to run it like a seminar, where you feel that you have a certain amount of sovereignty within the class to kind of pursue your studies from this point onward. Once you're done with that midterm, you're kind of making this class your own. Okay. Now, there is going to be another kind of summary journal for the readings in Module 3, but you notice those readings are pretty light. There's not a lot of reading there, because my sense of it is the key reading is going to be Kennedy. You could finish that thing in a day if you wanted to, but I think you're going to want to read it more than once. So when we come in a week from today on Tuesday, then be prepared to begin with Kennedy, okay? Because by then you'll have finished your midterms. They'll be posted. I will not have graded them yet, but you'll be done with those. So I would say that by next Tuesday, if you do nothing else, finish the Kennedy book, okay? At least first time around. Just even if you only skim it and make notes on key points. It's not a very long book. That was the whole idea. That, by the way, is this decolonization book, okay? Everyone should have a copy of that. And you can blow through that pretty quickly. I mean, when I first got it, I sat down and read it, and I put it away, waited a couple days, and then picked it up and read it again. And that second reading, even for somebody who does this as a living, was very useful for me. I picked up little subtleties that I had undervalued, and I think it's useful. All right, then, what we'll do, if there are no further questions or concerns or comments, is I will assume that I will see probably, it looks like about half of you, maybe a few more, on Thursday. Those of you who don't come in, I'm not going to take roll. If I forget and say sign in, and somebody wants to say, you said we didn't have to sign in, you're not taking roll. What I mean by that is I'm not going to enter it in the roll sheet. I'd still kind of like to know who's here, just in case, I need to contact you and say, hey, we talked about your case study on Thursday. I haven't gotten any follow-up from you or something. But I'm not going to include that in the regular roll on my separate roll sheet, is all I'm talking about. Anything else?
I have a question kind of about Memi's theory of him leaving his colony as resistance, and he gets criticized because I forget what it's called now. I thought I took notes on it, and I think I typed it in the wrong document, or didn't actually take notes on it, and I'm very delusional. But he has this idea that in order to at least to disrespect the colonial ruler, you should either actively resist or leave the colony to benefit people who are trying to resist that rule.
Yeah.
Well, what he gets a lot of.
Okay, understand. He's not talking about the colonized. He's talking about the colonizer.
Yeah.
Right? And so what he's saying is, he's not saying you should do one or the other. He's saying the only option you have as a colonizer who comes to the colony, probably trying to seek your own personal wealth or status, if you get there and you become appalled by what you see, okay, you are not going to succeed by trying to adopt some sort of allegiance with or shared loyalty to the colonized. They're not going to accept you. They're always going to know that by dint of your existence, you are always going to be safe compared to them from the repressive apparatus of the colonial administration and things like that, so that you will not be able to claim any meaningful solidarity. You will fail, okay? And that's his view of things. So your only alternative is to withdraw from the colonial mission altogether, to leave. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it makes sense why he gets criticism for it.
Yeah, right.
In the same way, people oh, you're a wimp.
Well, and again, you could.
I don't know if the
one can't say that, but what I think what Memi's response would be, no, it's not that you're a wimp or anything else. This is the way it works. You're not going to be able to overturn colonialism for all the empathy you may have for the colonized, and however shocked you may be at the racism or the brutality of the regime or anything else. You're not going to be able to change that there. You're not going to be able to do that. Because one of the risks is The degree to which you try to move against the colonial administration makes you vulnerable to some measure of that repressive apparatus yourself. You can be destroyed by the colonial administration too. You're not completely immune. If you resist, you become a problem to the colonial mission. You will be dealt with accordingly. It's embedded.
So the argument is that,
Sorry, go ahead, Kyle.
oh, so the argument is that there is no point in making that sort of sacrifice to end the colonial mission.
Well,
because you're already part of it, though it doesn't.
Yeah, it's sort of that. It's like, look, whether you like it or not, you're a colonizer. You may not like it, but
Okay,
you are.
so it's like you're screwed either way.
You're screwed either
Like-
way. Is really kind of what I mean. I'm
Okay,
oversimplifying a little bit for purposes of discussion. It's a subtle argument that would, again, and I could refer you to this book. See, if we were meeting physically, I could just leave the book for somebody to pick up or something like that, but we can't. We're not even hardly allowed to go on campus anymore. But you can, I mean, like I say, I looked around and found a copy of this. I don't know if I have the price here, but I think it was like $5. So it's around if you can find it, but it's relatively rare to me. I had trouble finding it and got lucky. I just found a copy that somebody was trying to get off of, and I think it was $5 plus shipping. Okay, but I couldn't assign it because it wasn't readily available, and I didn't see any point to doing that. Copying it somehow I felt was a little sacrilegious on that one, because it is kind of a classic work that, you know, is now kind of hard to get a hold of, and I don't know. I'm ambivalent about copying certain kinds of work. It's for the same reason I didn't copy Fanon. I mean, I think that, you know, go buy the book, own the book, have it on your shelf if you're serious about it. Otherwise, we can talk about it. You don't have to read it. I guess is what I'm saying. Does that help at all?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, that makes sense.
All right, great. All right, anything else? All right, then I will see some of you on Thursday. Otherwise, I will hopefully see all of you on Tuesday, by which time you will at least have had one go around with Kennedy's book, even if you haven't read any of the other two sources that are listed in Module 3, and we can begin our discussion of decolonization. Okay, so I'll see some of you on Thursday. Otherwise, I will see all of you on Tuesday.